Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Untangling Climate Finance, which is brought to you by Gordian Strategies. I'm the host, Jay Tipton. So far in this podcast, we've explored topics ranging from carbon markets and green bonds to forest projects and agriculture. Today, we're taking a new turn with our first expert in policy, and I couldn't be more excited. Yeah, you heard that right. Excited about policy. That big, somewhat daunting realm that pretty much dictates everything in the climate finance and environmental protection universe. Effective policy can accelerate our efforts to protect nature, develop new technologies, and expand green infrastructure. However, it can also present challenges, slowing down progress or complicating our initiatives. The key is to strike a balance between necessary safeguards and the flexibility needed to do the actual work. And addressing these challenges requires intelligent and committed individuals, like today's guest, Tim Mayle, the Executive Director at Environmental Policy Innovation Center, or EPIC. In their own words, EPIC's mission is to build policies that deliver spectacular improvement in the speed of environmental progress. And Tim is leading that charge. So let's hear from Tim and learn more about EPIC and the critical policy work they're doing to get some nature-based climate finance moving around the country. Let's go. Hey, Tim. Welcome to Untangling Climate Finance. Thanks for joining me. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Jay. Thanks for having me.
So let's just jump in. Why don't we start with you telling me a little bit about yourself, your name, where you work, your job title, all the good stuff.
Yeah, Tim Mayle. I am the Executive Director of an organization called the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, or EPIC, based in Washington, D.C. I've been in Washington, D.C. just about 20 years and have had a bunch of different jobs in government and out of government, and now leading a nonprofit since I've been here.
And are you from the East Coast originally?
I am. I'm from Connecticut. Grew up just outside of New Haven, and an old industrial city with what used to be one of the biggest rail yards in the entire eastern coast, and now is disappearing into forest, basically. So love to see that change of infrastructure going from the center of the country to nowhere. And then I moved after college. I moved to Australia, and then to Hawaii, then to Texas, and back to Hawaii and Australia. So I spent a bunch of time in much wilder places than DC before ending up here during the second Bush administration.
Wild in different ways. DC is probably wild, but in a different manner.
It's indeed.
That's great, though. You spent some time on some islands. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you can't, small communities, and you can kind of see everything that's going on in a much smaller microcosm of the world. So it's pretty nice. I grew up working on a 17-acre island in New York. And then, Hawaii's obviously a much bigger island with a lot more to it.
Yeah, without a doubt. All right, well, let's get into the company. So Environmental Policy Innovation Center, which is EPIC. I love that. That's a fantastic acronym. I don't know if that was done on purpose or if that just kind of was the way that it was, but it's awesome. Why don't you tell me about the company and what you guys do there?
Yeah, we've been around for 7 years. And the original conception of it was, can we find a team of people who really know their stuff and know what they want to do, have a great network of people, and want a little more space than their current operation allows them to have to do it? And centered on the theme of how do we move dramatically faster in environment, climate, and public health work, using policy to deliver that kind of fulcrum of speed. What we've actually evolved to be is a team a little less of this kind of a set of rogue individuals and more like a set of structured teams with a diversity of skills who operate, honestly, a lot better than that original conception. We have about 35 staff, and it's everything from, civil engineers to former municipal finance directors to people with science background like myself to lawyers to advocates to kind of local politicians for whom this is their main job and that is their second job. So it's a real diversity of team strengths, and they tend to be people who are good at pretty kind of narrow areas of technocratic work that we believe at least are the areas to really try to deliver a major acceleration in the speed of conservation.
Great. Are you operating across the entire country or just on the East Coast?
Yeah, we're pretty distributed. We started with 2 staff in Washington and then basically spread out during the pandemic. So we ended up with people from California to Canada, basically 35 staff and probably 25 states. We have a few more people now in the Washington, D.C. area than we used to. Maybe there's a fourth of our staff are within 80 miles or 60 miles of Washington, D.C., but still pretty remote. We use a couple of WeWork offices in Washington for our kind of home bases and good places to do meetings when we need them. But most of the folks are in, cities or towns by their lonesome.
Right on. I bet they like that. So why don't you go into more specifically about your role at Epic and what you do there?
Yeah. So, I guess all executive directors do different things, leaders, presidents, or whatever the title is that they have in an organization. And I guess the thing that I'm good at is kind of doing predictive work of where the ball is going when it comes to areas of policy that are going to be relevant in a near term political sense. So that's one of my jobs, is trying to keep my eye on the horizon. And a second one is just I spend a lot of time being a spokesman, advocate, and networker to bring different work together. So, for example, we work on procurement, which is an obscure word, which means basically government contracting, which is a boring field, right? Like it's super boring to talk about what's in a government contract. So we have to figure out how to make it interesting and relevant and figure out how to connect with people who don't work on government contracts, but are deeply influenced by them, to figure out how to talk to them about what are the problems and the opportunities driven by those contracts without ever really requiring them to necessarily have to know much about it. You talk to people about, well, what do you want to try to get done? What's keeping you from getting that done? Is it, too many agencies, too many cooks in the kitchen? Is it some particular part of a process is slowing you down? Some requirement is impossible to satisfy. Some key team asset is missing. We try to translate those things into the structures, right? Into the policy structures, like contracts that allow change to happen. And so my work is often being that translator, I guess, at the end of the day, is playing that translating role. And I have a great set of, program managers. We have a tech team, we have a water team, and we have a restoration team, and we have a small agriculture team. And I get to play a role in helping them all brainstorm and strategize, but they all have a lot of operational freedom in those areas and run great teams. So my job is really to kind of keep thinking about that kind of big picture stuff. And again, that translating role.
Yeah, it sounds like a very flexible, artistic position in the sense that you have to be able to get creative, I imagine, with your messaging and your communications and your conversations you have, especially when you're speaking with people that maybe don't have the level of sophistication that you're required about the things you're speaking about.
Yeah, everybody though has their work is pretty technical at the end of the day. One of the things that I find that I've gotten the most value out of in my career is realizing that there's a large chunk of people who would love to talk about themselves. I don't know if you have kids, but I have 2 kids and they can barely remember the name of the organization I work at, let alone what I do. And it's not their fault. It's not really a criticism. We're all in our little worlds.
Yeah.
So I find a lot of value just asking people, what was a good part of your week this week? What went wrong? Why did it go wrong? And just kind of letting them talk through in their own words, like where their job goes. And for me, I'm just constantly looking for the policy connection to that. So
yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. I like that. Well, you kind of touched on a few of the areas of Epic work, but I'm just going to list off what you guys do and we can then zoom in on a couple of them. But a lot of the focus is on ag, as you said, endangered species, water infrastructure, restoration, tech, procurement and finance, mitigation on tribal lands, and funding navigation. And then I know that you kind of oversee all of those, but you probably have some that you might be a little bit more close to. And so why don't you just tell me about some of the key projects or initiatives that you're working on that are tied to a couple of those that you think you could speak pretty clearly about?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to use an example. There's the CHIPS Act passed a couple of years ago now, which provides billions of dollars for semiconductor manufacturing, all the stages of semiconductor manufacturing in the United States.
Yeah.
And those involve building big new industrial facilities, right? Like that use water and land and energy and other things. Secretary of Commerce says last year was talking to Congress about the need to exempt those facilities from permitting NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, because it's just too hard. It's too hard, it's too slow to get an environmental impact statement done in the speed at which we're trying to spend that money and get America's semiconductor industry stood up. And I agree. I completely agree. Those are huge projects that absolutely have environmental effects. Meanwhile, and this is more of the space that we work on, someone who wants to go out and restore wetlands, they might have 10 or 20 or 30 or more years of experience in fixing wetlands and streams all around the country. Somebody who wants to fix a wetland spends 4 years on average, up to 12 years, trying to get a permit from the government to let them build that wetland. That's insane. That's the length of World War II to get a permit to fix a wetland from somebody who already knows how to fix a wetland. And usually, I mean, just to be frank, the people behind the desks in government who are approving the permits, at least some of them, have bachelor's degree worth of experience and no field experience doing it. So it's this ludicrous system of delaying a permitting that originally would have never, in 1873, in 1876, Nixon president, nobody would have ever said we're ever going to use, NEPA or these permitting structures to decide whether somebody can go out and fix a wetland.
Yeah.
And yet that's where we are today, just kind of policy creep. So we work on fixing things like that. That's like a key problem that it's pretty difficult to find somebody who's like, absolutely, it should take 4 years to get that permit, 1,000 times a year.
Yeah.
So we just have to figure out how to fix that. And so we have a team of people who spend a lot of time with the Army Corps, with state agencies that are involved in permitting, Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA. It's the whole vegetable stew worth of agencies are involved. Trying to figure out how do we cut time out of this process. And it's use of technology so that decision making can be faster, more transparent, that people have knowledge at their fingertips and decision support structures. It's goal setting from up high, right? It's like having somebody like Roll Band in Virginia, head of Virginia's Department of Environmental Quality, say like, we're going to do this faster and we're going to track it. And it could be teams from the bottom, right? Teams from the bottom saying we can do this better. We need to create, more structure. So we're talking to each other more frequently. And we need to, one of the legislative changes to NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, was one federal agency, kind of one lead person, one captain at the head of the table, basically to kind of manage process. Like stuff like that can make a pretty big difference in permitting. So it's a mix of those kinds of things we work on. Our goal is to see a large number of those restoration-related permits completely disappear. We just don't believe that they're needed for these kinds of projects. If the Secretary of Commerce can propose, excluding massive projects with significant effects from review, we can propose small benefit-directed projects for the environment from the same kind of thing. And then where you can't get rid of the existing permits because they're not needed, because there's a better way, trying to find alternatives that allow that process to go dramatically faster.
Right. And so you are all engaging with decision makers and lawmakers at basically every level, like local, state, and federal.
Yeah, that's right. Like the state of Connecticut has a great permitting initiative where they're, again, building a dashboard so people can see how long it takes and honestly where the permits are in the process, and a whole set of goals around making process more efficient. Another area of permitting reform is to use, programmatics, or, approve a whole bunch of permits in one go. General permit, any permit that kind of looks like the following criteria can get a permit automatically as long as they basically follow a recipe. So we're spending a lot of time with people throughout government and who are doing projects. And I gave the example of a wetland because it's kind of an easy, obvious one, but there's, a wide diversity of projects that can end up being beneficial for the environment at the end of the day that we care about. Even if you really want to, if we want to kind of push the edges of this discussion, if you think about a deployment of a gigawatt of wind power can harm birds, particularly eagles and raptors.
Mm-hmm.
And so on the one hand, project can have a significant local effect, certainly on those birds, maybe even a regional effect on bird populations if it's big enough and the project's really in the wrong place. But on the other hand, we did a calculation the other day, a truly back of the envelope, not a science piece, but a white napkin piece, to look at if you deploy a gigawatt of renewable energy, how many species is it saving on the planet? Not species you can name because faces of climate change extinction are mostly going to be invisible. But if it really is going to drive 10% of species on Earth extinct, what does a gigawatt contribute as a solution? And it's like 40 species, right? So deploying a gigawatt saves 40 species somewhere on the planet from extinction, but also hurts local eagle, raptor populations potentially. And how do you balance those two out? And from my perspective, there's a net positive there. You still have to deal with the current net negative for those species of birds, but there should be a different way to treat a project like that than there is for a project that's just a net negative for the environment overall.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I think that message is often lost in translation. Often when these types of things are being discussed openly, it's just trying to paint things too black and white, I think, but looking at the full picture of the pros and the cons. So I imagine that's a very delicate balance for you guys to try and find with the communication and with the messaging of the impacts of some of these policies could be like.
Yeah, well said. I mean, well said. It's new, right? I mean, that we're doing things differently than we did, and different areas of economic activity are important now than they were a decade ago, or certainly 2 decades ago. So, I mean, there is some adjustment to make.
Without a doubt.
And we need a lot more flexibility if we're going to transform our way out of this from an energy transformation perspective.
Yeah, at the speed that it's going to be required, which is much faster than where we're going now. So you've hit on some points of hindrance. I'm curious how policy frameworks can support the growth of specifically nature-based climate finance. So money that's going towards, let's just use the wetland example. How can a good policy framework help money going towards something that's nature-based in terms of restoration or protection?
Yeah, I mean, let me just unpack what nature-based means, at least to me, initially. So it's a wetland is a good example. Often, most categories of wetlands will be storing a lot of carbon. Forest is a good climate solution from a carbon storage perspective, but also lowering the risks and the magnitude of damage from floods, for example, or improving water quality. There's lots of different kinds of very natural systems that provide climate and a suite of other co-benefits to people. And then there's more artificial, like cyborg systems of a planted area with native plants on the side of a road, right? Things like that are also nature-based solutions, and pretty engineered kind of green-gray solutions in places like coastlines that are pretty vulnerable to both sea level rise and extreme storm events, flooding. You can imagine a mix, pick a city, you've probably been to some of them that need both, stone and concrete and other structural defenses, but where nature can also play a big role. So if you think about like a spectrum of nature-based solutions, and I didn't even mention things like agricultural production. So, how do we use agriculture to unlock, more environmental benefit is another big piece of this. So those are what I'm thinking of when we talk about nature-based work.
Yeah.
And then when I think about the finance side, I guess I just want to reference a little bit, for example, the housing market, right? So you have this whole set of structures that exist, way behind the scenes that I won't even pretend to understand, that are basically facilitating a large amount of public and bank and investor capital.
Yeah.
It's all creating an enormous amount of support for supply expansion or improvement, just generally supporting housing, right? So there's this whole, and then at the consumer end, you can get a loan, you can get all sorts of loans, you can get assistance on your loan. There's all these structures that exist. And if you think about that diversity of tools, that's just one example of some of the diversity of tools that exist in a non-environment related sector. We really need that same kind of spread of finance structures to be relevant for nature. And that doesn't exist right now the way it really needs to. So, I mean, one of the earlier rounds of financial tool was a debt for nature swap, right? So a country with a large amount of debt that they can't pay back, and a set of international donors who recognize that it won't be able to be paid back, saying, okay, if you do something beneficial for the planet, we'll forgive a large amount of your debt and restructure the remaining debt with more favorable terms, right? Like that's an example of a finance tool being brought to bear. I feel like debt for nature swaps had kind of a heyday back in the 80s, 90s, and then they went quiet for a while, and now they're back in vogue again, which is awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not awesome that places can't pay off their debt, but it is awesome at least that it's a tool that has a cyclical set of uses that have kind of winners on both sides from a country's perspective and then from nature's perspective. So that's an example of like a policy framework that is definitely supportive of nature. We are one of the program areas we work in is something called the State Revolving Loan Fund, which is a EPA administered, congressionally funded, but EPA administered fund that makes an allocation to every single state and U.S. territory every year. The states and territories put that money into an account They use it to pay water utilities for improvements in infrastructure. Utilities pay it back at something like a 99% success rate, very few defaults. And then the states rotate the capital back into new projects. And in the past, roughly 3 to 4% of that money has gone to nature-based solutions effectively. And one of our policy goals is to see that number kind of double or triple, move toward 10%. That's an example of a tool that is able to provide support for nature-based projects. And it could be a loan, just simply a loan for something that like the kinds of structural and green approaches that I mentioned before. It could be something like a loan guarantee behind a land trust that wants to protect a forest that might be in the headwaters of a water supply, but also provide a lot of carbon storage. It could be a loan for that same project, and a whole set of other kind of innovative things in between. So those are things that I think are supportive of a lot more investment in nature-based solutions. And I mean, because I work in policy, right? So I'm at the space of really not the pure private play for some of this work, but really the space where there is a government role or a philanthropic role in some cases to make the money side of the equation work out. So those are the examples I'm giving.
Yeah, those were great. We actually have written a couple different times on the debt for nature swaps, and I personally find that to be an extremely innovative tool. As you said, you don't want countries that have high debt to be in that situation, but it kind of goes back to what you said earlier, which was looking at the net positives. And for us, it seems that debt for nature really does allow all ships to rise with the tide. For the most part, it really does have like a 360-degree positive side to it. I really like that one. I think it's a very innovative one. Of course, if we're talking inside of the U.S. and we have different states and different regions, it's difficult to just copy and paste certain policies. But I am curious if there's any like successful nature-based climate finance policy models that you've seen that you feel like can be replicated or scaled across different regions or different states that can amplify the impact.
Yeah, I mentioned procurement or government contracting before. And one of the areas of change in that contracting that we're kind of relentless advocates on are outcome contracts or pay for success contracts. Pay for success is what the Obama administration first kind of called them. But the basic concept is instead of giving people money along the way for the kind of technical things they do, like moving a bulldozer or planting something or labor hours, you wait till there's evidence of success and you pay based on that. And at the end of the day, government shouldn't really care about the unit costs, right? The labor and the bulldozer and the shovels and the grass seed. They should just care about the thing at the end. And I mentioned that it's a weird thing to describe as a solution in the finance space, but if you're going to change contracts, they're structured so the payment comes later, like sometimes, 2, 3, 4, 5 or more years later. Somebody needs money to pay for those things until the government check is cut. So it depends on finance. And to me, people often focus on, well, why do that? And why create that kind of structure, that complexity? Why not just let the contract go the way it was going before? And it's because the insertion of the private lender, effectively, or the equity investor into the picture creates a different set of incentives for the people involved and a different level of accountability, right? You have somebody who really cares about the result and getting to a finish line so that they can get paid. And who thinks about risk in a different way is a bit maybe more agnostic approach to the whole thing. And unlike government, isn't worried about saying less than positive things about its own work for fear of penalty, right? Like an investor, that something's not working out, they go in a new direction, but an agency, something's not working out even temporarily, and it can be a huge punitive political backlash that happens. So we think these structures are really crucial. And of course, they motivate the people who are in the middle, the people delivering projects, to do their work well, to meet the government's expectations, and to do their work well to meet the expectations of the investors. So that structure, we really got excited about it because a company called Corbius got started doing this project with a county in Maryland that was way behind on its water quality objectives. Its goal is to improve the treatment of basically stormwater runoff. And what's built into a $400 million partnership to use non-public finance to pay for a bunch of work on hundreds of projects.
Wow.
That then is ultimately paid back by the county to meet a permit goal. So a structure like that could be replicated everywhere around the country. We've done some work in the state of Maryland with the former governor's team as well as the legislature on a bill called the Conservation Finance Act for state policy to put in place kind of a broad set of incentives to drive more private finance into conservation. But one of the pieces of that law that was most important and the kind of policy that we love is just a single sentence, really a clause in a sentence that says it's an allowable thing for the state to do contracts that pay for the result at the end of the process.
Wow.
And it truly is a clause in it. And it's taken 2 more laws to get passed to just clarify to agencies that, yes, you really can use this.
Yeah.
It just got done this year, but it's just kind of a transformational thing. And I love hearing from, for example, the director of the Connecticut Green Bank is always saying, like, that law in Maryland, we love that. We want to see something like that here in Connecticut. So that's an example of a really replicable thing. And it really does create both what we look for is the incentives for performance and speed and using private investment in that role.
Yeah, that's encouraging to hear that other states see that and they're like, bring that here. We want a little bit of that ourselves. And you kind of teed me up for my next question. You touched on it a couple different times, which was the private capital. I'm curious what role you see public-private partnerships playing in the scaling up of nature-based climate finance and how policy can encourage more of those partnerships.
When you think about what's the role of government, right? What do you expect from government? And as somebody who believes in democracy, I believe that government is supposed to deliver, services to people and do it at least some of the time relatively well. But there's a limit to what, any set of people can do, right? There's cultural structures that exist in any bureaucracy. Government has its own versions of those. They're going to make them better at doing something versus others. I'm waxing philosophical here because at the end of the day, I think that we've gone through a period in the country where we expect the government to do things it is not capable of doing, that no kind of institution on its own is going to perform well. And an example I give is just when there's a program associated with energy infrastructure in the Midwest that had to deal with endangered species impacts. And the basic outcome was, we'll give a bunch of money to state wildlife agencies. The state wildlife agencies will spend the money, and the state wildlife agencies would also verify and validate what happened with the money. And by the way, we're not going to allow the amount of money that they collect to increase. They're going to be capped because we want to give certainty to the energy sector. And the system fails, right? They end up spending a chunk of the money buying a building in a distant state. That was not an environmental investment, a building. And on the one hand, you can pick on the individuals involved, but it's really about all the checks and balances being stuck in one place. So when I think about the role of private capital and private structures, I just wish we could have a conversation more about, what are realistic expectations if it were just government, and what are more realistic expectations if you have 2 or 3 parties involved. And I tend to think 3 parties are the best arrangement, where you have government in more of a programmatic and oversight role, calling balls and strikes, and you give the private sector room to operate and really a lot of incentive to deliver the things that government wants. And then ultimately you have a client. It might be the public, it might be a buyer of something, some sort of environmental good or service. But that structure can work really, really well. So when I think about what is the role of private finance, is that it can really help when you have a clear public goal, or when you have a public goal, private sector can help make the goal clearer and sharper in terms of exactly what it is that humans can produce that at the end of the day, government is buying, right? So climate with less than 2 degrees of warming, or whatever we want our target to be, has to be broken down into specific categories of activity strategies, and then objectives within those strategies, and ultimately targets for individual things. And the private sector is really good at helping do that, so that you end up with something that parties can say, we understand how this is connected to our big goal. And on the other side, on the private side, we understand what we're going to get paid to do. We want to understand what success looks like.
Yeah.
There are a lot of public policies where subjectivity reigns, where you don't know, no one can know whether at the end of a project or an initiative or program, it will have succeeded. The actual vision of success and the specifics of success are totally murky. When you have these arrangements with public and private side by side, you can often get a lot of clarity around that, of what success looks like. And even when those programs fail, because it's transparent, it's a lot easier to improve them. So when I think of like the role of private finance, that's to me the role that it is kind of most powerfully engaged in. It drives a lot more clear resolution of what we're trying to achieve in the first place. And then it allows scale to happen. So you know this from your other podcasts and guests, but people don't want to invest 10 million or a million, for God's sakes, in something. They're looking for 50 million or $100 million deals.
Yeah.
So now you've got clear expectations, and now you're talking about bringing real capital to the table to scale them. That's the space that I get most excited about. So one of the areas we work in is biodiversity crediting, the idea that we can, associated with especially corporate disclosure requirements, companies are going to be looking to offset or compensate for the impacts they have on nature. And just at a meeting yesterday in New York City, and someone said that, we've done an assessment. There's now $1 billion in structured funds that are explicitly targeting biodiversity. I'm like, that is huge, $1 billion, right? Like within a couple years of this, of interest materializing in this space, we're already at $1 billion. And that's what gives me a lot of hope and excitement around the private sector side.
That was really well said. Such a practical way of looking at it. That was extremely clear, and I think that you nailed it right on the head. And the $1 billion, by the way, for biodiversity credits is also very encouraging to hear. I mean, you probably are sitting in on more conversations about that than I am, but from my own reading and just scouring what's out there, I've seen it come up more frequently. And I hope that this is a trend, that this particular conversation is going to be one that gets a lot more focus. And as you said, we're talking $1 billion with a B, that's some serious cash in capital. So there's movement.
Yeah, we need to get to 10, but I think we'll be there in a couple of years. If we redo this podcast in 3 years, I would be surprised if it weren't 10 billion at that point.
Yeah, that's the optimism. I like that. All right, well, we're going to wrap it out soon. So I want to ask a question. I don't know if it's easier for you to answer this on a U.S. federal level or maybe more on a regional level, but because you have 2 sons, I think you said, that are going through school, I'm going to give it to a school format. So if we're going to give the U.S. a score on kind of where it is in the current policy environment that's related to nature-based climate finance, are we getting an A, a B, a C, a D? And are we moving? Are we going in the wrong direction, or are we getting better?
Oh, this is tough. I'm an optimist, but we're like a 3. I'm going to give it a really low score in terms of policy environment for the kind of finance that we're talking about.
Yeah.
I say that as an optimist because the potential to go up is so obvious, but I'm going to give it a 3.
We're low. We've got room for improvement. You would not be happy, I think, if your son came home and said, "Dad, I got a 3 on this test." You're like, we got to do better.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's not what we're looking for. And so do you think, you're an optimist, how does 2024 look? Is it going to improve, or are we kind of in this gray area where the future is a little bit unknown and it can go in either direction?
Yeah, it's improving, right? It really is improving. I mentioned the Maryland Conservation Finance Act. There's some really interesting stuff coming out of Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA, the new federal funds, EPA's green bank funding, $20+ billion being spent, setting up state, regional, local green banks. A lot of failure will happen there, a lot of brilliant success and innovation. There's a whole bunch of promising stuff happening. The place that we least have evidence of forward progress right now in the United States is if you apply those same kinds of areas of innovation I just mentioned explicitly toward nature. So Forest Service, USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, their state counterparts. There is just so much lower level of adoption of real creativity in those places.
Yeah.
And it partly is people, right? So it's not a weird thing to run into somebody with an MBA in some of the places with more success that I just mentioned. But on the other side of the house in the conservation agencies, it would be very weird. And it would especially be weird to see them in a senior role. People with a huge technology background, same thing. You'd be much more likely to find somebody with a higher job title up at working on program and mission related work at Department of Energy than you would, over at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we really have to build a team that can accept these really creative ways to, they're not, honestly, sometimes not even that creative, like loans, right? I mean, honestly, if there could just be loans for every area of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, I'd be pretty happy. But loans are still a rarity. The SRF program, the whole thing is a loan program, 4%, 5%, going to nature-based solutions, kind of counting it optimistically. In most areas, there's no loan programs at all. That's not even innovation, right? It's just taking a tool that's hundreds of years old and bringing it into this space. So
Yeah, it's falling back on the basics there, right? It's like instead of always trying to reinvent, let's just use what's been working.
I mean, that's what I love. But we're called the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, but sometimes it's just it should be just a copying center, right? Like we used to do the same thing somebody's done somewhere else and just make it, give it to somebody else and let them call it their own and get a lot done.
Yeah, totally. Well, my last question, I always close out the episodes with this. You mentioned philosophy earlier. Are you familiar with Stoicism?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, Epictetus, who is one of the most famous of all the Stoics, once said, "What concerns me is not the way things are, but the way people think things are." And so we're going to apply this to policy because that's your expertise. What do you think is one thing that must be done to change the way people think about how policy can drive real environmental impact?
The perception and reality come up all the time. And if I were looking at one thing, it would be that humans have been successfully fixing natural spaces for more than 100 years. And nature itself is really good at preparing itself. So if 70% roughly of the planet's land area is degraded, we know how to fix the majority of that. But people don't think we do. The nature is irreplaceable is in part true, but actually also part not true. We're pretty good at putting a lot of it back in place. Klamath River will be the next success sign of that in a couple of years. And policy drove a lot of that, right? Like we put a lot of money into figuring out the science and the practice of fixing places around us. If we could change that expectation that we can't repair places that we've broken, often accidentally, then we're going to be stuck for a while. Conversely, if we can fix that perception, there is an enormous amount of capital we can put to use, creating amazing natural spaces out of places that have lost kind of some of their functionality, and also creating amazing human spaces that people really want to live in and play in, and that are worth investing in, right? Like that's where the real dollars are going to come about, is when people are intentionally building nature integrated with a deeply human space and creating a lot of co-benefits from that. So if I could change one thing, it would be that. It would be the perception that humans are outside of nature, and that when we're present, we are mostly a force for bad, and that actually we can do enormously good things to nature when we try, and we can do it at scale.
That was excellent. Thank you, Tim. I really hope that the listeners take that and they sit on that for a little bit, because that was good. I'm going to for sure reflect on that, because I think you're right. I think that sometimes we disconnect these things and think we're moving in opposite directions, but oftentimes we do have the ability to work in harmony. So very good. That was a good one. Well, Tim, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you carving out some time out of your day. It was good to chat.
Jay, thanks so much. Really appreciate the chance to talk to you about climate finance and Stoicism.
Right. Of course. Appreciate it, Tim.
Take care.
And that is a wrap on today's episode. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to check back next month, because I'll be here again, ready to rock and roll. But before you hit the road, take a quick minute to subscribe and drop us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Spotify, don't forget to hit the little bell in the top right for notifications on fresh new episodes. And also, we're not just about untangling climate finance, because we churn out weekly audio episodes of our newsletter, Sliced. And trust me, they're the perfect little listen to learn more about what is happening in carbon markets, climate finance, and environmental protection. Finally, if you want to connect, please shoot me an email at jtipton@gordianstrategies.com. A link to my email address is in the show notes. Catch you next time.